Depressing.
Depressingly so.
You've chosen Simon Danchuk's piece in the Mail on Sunday at the beginning of the programme.
What I find we have to do is to remember the atmosphere of the times. It's very easy to forget that things looked different in those days.
Geoffrey Dickens was widely attacked as a kind of buffoon for raising this at the time.
Yes, indeed. He was widely regarded as a chap who was always falling over his own feet. Also, at that time, I think most people would have thought that the establishment, the system, was to be protected. And if a few things had gone wrong here and there, that it was more important to protect the system than to delve too far into them. Now that view, I think, was wrong then, and it is spectacularly shown to have been wrong because the abuses have grown.
Do you think there was a big political cover-up at the time, back 30 years ago?
I think there may well have been, but it was almost unconscious. It was the thing that people did at that time.
You didn't talk about these kinds of things?
You didn't talk about those sort of things. It's not the sort of thing that people did, not even, if I may say so, television journalists, let alone the politicians.
Would have raised it. So a big public inquiry now, do you think?
I think that Mr Cameron is right initially to have looked for a distinguished judicial figure, to have a look at it, to see what the dimensions of the problem are, to report back fairly quickly, I hope,
yes.
And then will arise the question of what sort of further inquiry is needed into it.
Right. Helena Kennedy, not just Conservatives drawn into this, one of the papers saying there's a Labour peer involved as well.
Yes. Listen, sexual abuse exists in all parts of society, and it would be surprising to imagine that parliamentarians are not going to have, amongst them, people who have been involved in it. Powerful people. And people who are powerful, of course, can then use that power to prevent their wrongdoing coming to light. I mean, one of the things, I think Nolan's absolutely right. There was a way in which the establishment was able to protect itself, and it felt that actually to expose bad things was to undermine the whole kind of firmament. And we saw it over time. We saw it with Irish cases that went badly wrong. Nobody wanted to examine them closely enough. And I think we've shifted to a time when people aren't going to accept that anymore. There has to be openness and transparency. But going back, this business that there were 114 sex abuse files, I mean, they're in the...
Disappearing dossiers is about the most toxic thing there could be.
Absolutely, because, I mean, it's not as though we don't... I mean, archiving is one of the great things that has disclosed miscarriages of justice. And this is about miscarriage of justice because it's about people who were making complaints and bringing to light abuse, and they weren't being listened to, and they were actually being written off as being fantasizers and so on. And then it turns out that actually much of this has truth in it. And it was about not listening, but it was also about men particularly in power being able to actually use the system to cover up for themselves. And that goes for celebrities and so on. But it's rather interesting that the attacks on the BBC by parliamentarians are now coming home to roost, because it turns out that Parliament has been the seat of a whole lot of bad stuff that involves cover-ups too.
So a grim time for those of us who love Parliament, but a necessary cleansing coming as well.
I suspect
I think so, yes.
That's right. Well, let's move on to the next big story, Lord Tebbitt, which is, of course, Islamism. I was just saying at the beginning, you've got, I think, a Sunday Telegraph